Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Can someone give me a thumbs up? If yeah, okay. That's efficient. Welcome to this talk about the Odoo CLI or command line interface. I'm Damien. I used to be a developer at Odoo. Now I've moved into the product management team, but I mostly work with developers on technical tools. And one of the things I noticed recently while doing debugging with someone who couldn't find a problem in their code is that a lot of developers remain, in some cases, quite far from their tooling, especially the command line, and they use stuff like PyCharm setups that launches the server and use the debugger and configure everything more or less automatically. And I tend to see that these people that use these tools will somewhat be lacking in some skills because they don't go, in my opinion at least, close to the metal, let's say. So this talk is about a little bit of that and all the options that you can do with the Odoo command line interface. There are some useful stuff on which I will spend a lot of time. The idea is to go through nearly all the options, some of which I will just mention in passing, some I will explain in more detail. The first question, of course, to ask is why you should care about knowing this. The idea here is that the more you know about your tools, the less time you will lose because of frustration or simply because you don't know where to look. Even if you're a front-end developer, you will at some point have to run a database locally, and knowing all these options can help. Even if you only work locally as a Python dev, you will at some point have to try something in multiprocessing mode or set Odoo behind a proxy and understand what this entails. And if you use containers, then I'm afraid all hope is lost for you, at least in my opinion. I know it's like a hill I will be able to die on if I want to. But in my opinion, this usually means that you're so far removed from the software that it becomes super complicated to get hands deep into it. And in the case of Odoo, if you take something like React or Django, you seldom have the need to go into the code or to go really close to the framework itself. In the case of Odoo, it's difficult to extricate what you need to do from having to look around into the code of the server itself. So if you learn to use these tools and others as well, you will be able to develop faster, to debug faster, and usually I think that's one of the most impactful side effect of knowing all this. You will be able to improve performance or to test performance more easily, and generally you will work a little bit more efficiently. The problem with that, of course, is the other side of the coin, is that when you ask the Odoo command line what it can do, you get approximately, I don't know, 500 lines of explanations that use concepts or IDs that are not clearly defined in this documentation, and it's a little bit unclear what an option does. So the idea here is that we'll go through them, and if it needs a little bit more deep dive into a concept, then we will take the time to do just that. So let's dive in. First, you have to remember that you have the basic command of the odoo-bin server, which will be actually the server command. It's not explicit. You seldom use it explicitly. But we have a lot of other commands as well. We have the start command, which it's kind of funny that I begin with this one, because my only advice is to never use it. It's basically some kind of a shortcut that will launch another server, set it up using guessing a database name based on the current directory. It's like a quick start, but clearly my goal here is to teach you how to dive into the details, and this one does the complete opposite. You can, by the way, I will show where all this source code is, so you can have a look if you want, but it's kind of weird. We have the shell command, which is super useful, especially for testing performance, for example. What it does is basically set up the complete Odoo server, then leaves you with an empty prompt and interface, an interactive shell. So you can basically do anything you would do in normal Odoo code, but have it interactive with what you do. And one of the most useful thing I ever did when working in production with this is if you want to launch a script that massively impact the database. For example, you need to archive thousands of records at once. You can pipe a script, a Python script that basically use the Odoo framework language and pipe it to the command, and it will run without having to worry about timeout that you might have if you use the web interface, stuff like this. So it can be quite useful. The only essential thing to remember about this mode is that, wait, I can move, I think, to the laser pointer option. Okay, that's neat. The only thing to remember is that by default, everything you do remains in a single database transaction. And if you want the changes that you apply to be effectively saved to the database, you need to commit the cursor database explicitly. But it also means that whatever you do until you commit, you can undo, and it's fine. So even if you explore on a production database, until you commit, you probably are doing nothing bad, except, of course, if it sends outgoing emails or notifications, stuff like this. So that's the shell mode. We have the clock that probably a lot of you might have seen and wonder why it was there. The reason this is there is that we use it internally at Odoo to invoice maintenance to our customers. What we usually advise as well to partners is that if you develop code for a client, we advise you to have them pay for this maintenance. And internally, we use this to have them pay per lines of code. So I don't remember the exact amount. I think it's 15 euros per 100 lines of code or something like this. But the way we count lines of code is a bit tricky, because, for example, if one of our business analysts develop some kind of automation that use Python code in a server action, how do you count that? It's not easy to access from the outside, and this is what this tool does. You can either have it run on a path in your local machine, that it will just basically run a clock command, the classic clock command. And if you run it on a database, it will go and inspect several kinds of objects that might contain code that will usually mean there's maintenance to do at some point if you upgrade or if there's a bug. And it will count the line of code of these objects and remove the comments, of course. So that can be useful for you if you decide to go into the maintenance costs per lines of code. If you don't, just know it exists or even forget about it, then you won't need it. This one, actually, I discovered while doing this talk. I had no idea it existed. What it allows you to do is to push an install data module, so something that is only based in XML, no Python file. You can push that to any instance directly. So basically, it will zip the folder, upload it to the database, have it installed there, and you can control whether you want it to be installed or updated using the force argument here. And it will auto-install this for you. Honestly, I'm a bit surprised that it exists, because it's kind of automating something that's quite rare and does not really, in my opinion, require a lot of automation, but it's there if you need it. If you want to test installable modules quickly, for example, if you decide to develop industry modules that Fabien talked about this morning, it might be a quick way to deploy them on test databases. But other than this, I don't see a lot of effective usage. We have the db command, which is basically the equivalent of the database manager that you have in the web interface. So you can dump a database with or without the file store. You can restore a database. This one, I think, can be quite useful if you want to automate some kind of backup system, because it means that you have a complete backup of any database you want in a relatively short amount of time. Note that, because I know that sometimes people are interested to know how we do it internally, we personally don't use this to manage our backups, for the simple reason that we have a huge amount of databases per cloud server, usually in the thousands, and so it's better to just dump all the databases at once using the Postgres commands. But if you have a smaller setup, this can probably do the job quite well. We have the neutralize command, which is quite new. I think it only exists since 2 years ago or something like this. And basically, what it allows you to do is to neutralize, in the sense that once you have run this command, all the objects that have side effects outside of the database, so outgoing email servers, payments and shipping connectors, notification, push notification tokens, everything is disabled. And then you have a database that has no side effects. So if you want to test something, like convert a production database to a pre-prod or staging, it can be quite useful. And by the way, it's super easy if you have custom modules where you want to have this neutralization effect built in and have it work with this command. You simply need to write an SQL script that you put in the data directory of your module, and you call it neutralize.sql. And it will be called by this neutralization mechanism. So if you want to have modules that have a deactivation mechanism built in, that's really the way to go. And by the way, if you use Odoo SH, unless I'm mistaken, I think that when you do a staging environment, this is actually run on the production database. And so if you have custom modules that have side effects, it can be really nice to do that for your Odoo SH instances, because it can avoid costly mistakes like the intern that sends a mass mailing to 5,000 people. We have the populate option. It's a little bit more specific, and it's a little bit more complicated to use if you want to do it yourself. But the idea here is that if you want to do any kind of load testing, performance testing, you can write Python scripts that will generate a certain amount of data in the database. A certain amount is usually something quite big. Basically, you have options in this line, in this command line, to decide if you want to populate with a small, medium, or large size. The small is usually creating tens of records just to have some data to play around with. It's like kind of cheap demo data if you want. Usually you will want to concentrate on the bigger aspects of this, so hundreds of thousands of records, or possibly millions if you have something that is really high volume. It can be slow to run because it basically goes through the ORM to create everything. And in some cases, you have interdependencies between populate modules and populate commands. So if you want to populate the CRM with 100,000 records, it will also have to populate with a lot of partners, contacts, a lot of tags, and it will create a lot of data, so it can be quite slow to run. But at least if you want something that is reproducible and that is easy to set up for other people, you can take some time to do this. This is documented as well. Most of what, I think nearly all of what I'm going to say today is documented. I will provide a link to the documentation if you don't have it at the end of the talk, but most of this is in the documentation. And in the case of the populate, I think we have a dedicated section explaining how you can write these population scripts by yourself. We have the scaffold command, which is, again, something that you might want to use when you are a beginner, but usually at the end you don't need them anymore. What it does is we copy for you a template module that we put in the source code, and that way you start with something that is already structured according to the accepted guidelines of an Odoo module. So you have the models and the controllers, Python files in their own subdirectories. You have the data and the demo files, again, separated properly, and the manifest file that combines all of this. After some time, you usually don't need it anymore. However, if you also want to be more active on the website end of things, if you want to develop a theme, for example, we have also a template for that. And I think this is new for this year. We have also a template if you ever want to do a payroll localization. I don't know how it arrived there, and when we have the payroll localization, but not the accounting one. I guess the accounting one is probably a bit more complex in the sense that it's rare that you have a single way to do it. But if you want, it's there. All these live in the source code in the... yeah, that's more or less readable. Perfect. In the CLI module of the Odoo source code, you have all these commands here. There are two commands I didn't talk about at all, and that I will not talk about at all today. It's the gen proxy token command. It exists to basically generate tokens for the IoT box, I think, to correctly work with in a SSL environment. You probably don't need it. And the tsconfig is even more obscure. I think, if I remember correctly, it sets up a TypeScript environment, but we don't actually use TypeScript inside of Odoo. We only use it for all, and you're probably never going to build all by yourself. So if you want, you can have a look. It's there. You can read what it does, but it's not something that's generally used outside of a few key people inside of Odoo. But as I said, the main command that I want to talk to you about today is the normal or the classic, the default command, which is the server command that you use basically every day. I will follow the sections that are in the document in the odoo-bin -h command, so the help command. They are structured in a, I would say, organic way. So clearly some things are in a weird place. I can tell you that making this talk gave me the idea of restructuring all this a little. Obviously, it's a little bait for version 17, but maybe in the future. But let's begin with the what are called the command options. First, you have the config options. So basically, if you use -s, it means that whatever you used as a parameter when launching the server will be saved to a file in the home directory. And by default, Odoo will always look for this file and always load all the parameters from there. So that means that you might have parameters that are invisible. If you ever want to have a look at them, simply, oh, wait, I'm switching from QWERTY to Authority, so that's not always easy. Nope. Okay. And if I look into the odoorc file that I have on my machine, I have all these options set to something because at some point I saved it. And always keep in mind that if you have a server behaving a bit weirdly or using parameters that you did not set, it might be simply because all of this is in the rc file at the root of the home directory. We have the, oops, sorry. Yeah, the installation and update commands. A lot of people don't know this, but the difference between these two is basically that the -i will load all the data in the XML files, including the one that is marked as being non-updatable. So if you set no update equals something truthy in the XML file, it will only get loaded when you do a -i. This means that if you do this on a module that has already been installed, it will basically reset the configuration, recreate any missing record that the customer might have deleted, and it will also reset everything to the default. So if you have, for example, a default document workspace that gets installed, it will do that again and possibly rename or change what the user has done. So basically, don't use it in production. It's usually something that you will want to control a bit more carefully. Without demo is quite explicit. I'm sure a lot of you know it. By default, Odoo will install locally with demo data enabled, which is debatable. Some people like it, some people don't like it. Personally, I think it's quite useful to have demo data when you develop because it means that you can more quickly test stuff. But to each his own, you can disable it with just setting this parameter to something falsy, and it will disable the installation of the demo data. The -p command is also something I didn't know about. Basically, it allows you to import a lot of records from XML files, usually from coming from another software. For example, if you want to import existing records from the customer's previous system, you might do it this way. The difference between that and a normal import is that, first of all, it's done in the command line and not in the web interface. So if there is no timeout here, it will process whatever you throw at it, even if it takes 2 days. And also, it will commit after each record. So if you have 1 million records to import, and it fails after a few hundred thousands, you can start again from where it stopped. Everything that got imported before is saved into the database as well. So can be useful. The PID file, it's really a bit more advanced. You usually don't need it in development at all. In production, you might need it if you have other systems that need to interact with the process of the Odoo server. Mainly, for example, to watch the status of the service to see that it's running correctly or not. And if you want to put the PID file in a specific location, you can do that with this command. Add-ons path is pretty well known if you use Enterprise because you have to always say to the Odoo server, of course you have all the community add-ons, but all the Enterprise add-ons are in that module over there. You can also do the same thing for upgrade path. So for example, if you write your own upgrade scripts for your own module, you either can include these migration scripts inside the module itself, and they can run automatically that way. But if you want to separate them like we do, for example, internally at Odoo. Then you can specify to the server if you need to upgrade, all the files to upgrade are there, and can be quite useful if you want to keep them separated. The load argument is usually never used, and it's something that not a lot of people know, and not a lot of people know what it's for. The idea of this is that you want to load the module's controllers outside of the scope of a database. So for example, if you take the web module, which is by default what this command will always include, this means that all the routes that start with /web, and for example, /web/database/manager are loaded even if you don't have any database on the server itself. In the case of the web module, it's quite obvious that you need access to the database manager if you want to manage your database, even if there is no database. But in some cases, for example, if you have modules that might interface with the databases themselves, for example, something that might be able to trigger a backup of the complete server or stuff like this, you might want to use this option. If you use an OCA module that needs this, it will be documented, of course. But if you ever find yourself coding something a little bit more technical that needs to sit above the database and the registry of models, that's usually where you will put it. And the data dir option, the last of the common options, is where do you want to store all the binary files. So basically, all the mail attachments, all the documents that you upload to the database, we will store them in that directory, and the way we store it means that there is no duplicate. So even if you upload the same 50 megabyte binary file, a PDF or a video into a mail message, we only save it once to the disk in that directory. So that's the basics command. It's funny that it's called basics or common because half of them nobody ever uses, but it's still in that section. Let's move on to the HTTP server stuff. There is the basically normal options for any HTTP server that you might use. So on which hostname or on which interface am I listening? This means that if you want to have, for example, a server that only accepts requests from the local LAN, if you don't want this to be leaked on the WLAN, or if you only want to access your hosting, your server from the local host, you can bind to specific interface. By default, we listen to all interfaces. You can also control the port to which we listen to. By default, it's 8069, as you all know. And yes, I think the joke was on purpose. It was 20 years ago. I wasn't there, but I think it was on purpose. The long polling and JVM port are basically just synonymous. And if you never work in multiprocessing mode, you will never use it. But if you ever need to deploy in production, this means that you will need the multiprocessing mode, and you need to understand this. Basically, you have two kinds of processes in the Odoo server if you work in multiprocess mode. Or basically, you have three kinds of processes. You have the normal worker that will just get a request for the website or for the backend and do its stuff and then reply and then process another request. You have the cron processes that will process, wake up every minute, check if there is a background task to process and process it. And then you have the gvented workers. Gvent, if you don't know, is a Python library that makes a lot of Python operation asynchronous, which means that the same process can kind of spawn multiple little processes called greenlets that will handle code asynchronously and be able to juggle between these. What's the goal of this process? It's to manage all the chat connections, basically. Because chat connections are long-lasting. You need to stay connected to the server when you're chatting with people or to get notifications about new messages, which means a lot of people need to be able to be connected at the same time. And this process manages that. And you can specify on which port it should listen to. When you do that, you also need to set up your proxy. Usually we work with Nginx. Perhaps some of you work with Apache, but I don't know the documentation of Apache, so I won't go into details. But in Nginx, you simply need to specify, okay, all the requests coming for the long polling route, for example, needs to be routed to this process. No HTTP is basically if you want to have something that just runs locally, doesn't accept any external requests. If you ever deploy Odoo as a WSGI application, you might want to use it. But honestly, I've never seen this in the wild. I'm sure some people do it, but personally, I don't see a lot of use for it. Proxy mode is important as well because it has impact on your security. What proxy mode does, it basically tells Odoo that if you receive a request, to know where the request came from in terms of the IP of the client, you need to look not in the normal header, but in a specific header set by a proxy in between Odoo and the client. Again, usually it's Nginx. And this means that if you are actually working behind Nginx and you don't put this proxy mode on, what you will get in your logs is all requests are coming from usually localhost or the server where the Nginx is located. If you set proxy mode to true, it means that Odoo will look into a special header that you configure into the Nginx configuration and will know for whom this request has been proxied to Odoo. On the other hand, if you set proxy mode to true while it's not sitting behind something that will set this header, this means that people can spoof their IP when they communicate with the server, which may be used in security attacks to mask their actual location or IP address. So if you're behind Nginx, always set it to true. If you're not behind Nginx or Apache, make sure that it's never set to true because it might be a hole in your security. And finally, we have another option that interacts with Nginx, which is the X send file option. This can be used to offload some processing power from back from Odoo and move it to Nginx. And in this case, it's about static files. So basically, everything that sits in the data directory that we spoke about before. If you configure it properly, what will happen instead of Odoo having to get the request, verify that the user has the right to access the document he wants to see, and then go on the disk, get the file, and send it to the client. Instead, Nginx will just go into Odoo, check, okay, does the user have the right to go and get this document? Odoo will simply reply either no, and then you get a 403, or yes. And by the way, it will tell Nginx the file is located in that location. And instead of Odoo having to go and read on the disk and use a single process of Odoo that is quite of a commodity or rare commodity, it will instead delegate that job to Nginx, which is literally built for that and can do it massively more parallelly than Odoo does it. And also it means that your Odoo process will be able to handle the request of someone else to do something else. If you have only small files, it's not going to have that much of an impact. If you have something like videos hosted on your server that you serve through Odoo, it might make a difference. We use this on our cloud as well. We actually developed it for us for the e-learning application, I think, so that if you upload a lot of videos, then you can serve them using Nginx instead of using Odoo, and we liberate some amount of processing power back to Odoo. So that's the HTTP stuff. Okay. Nothing super fancy. Then we have the database filter category, which basically only holds one option, which is the database filter option. I'm not surprising anyone here. On production, you might use it, though often you will instead route stuff to the correct database using Nginx. What it does is basically it allows you to write a regular expression that will decide whether or not a database that sits on the same server in the Postgres cluster is accessible or not through the web interface. It can be useful in some cases for security restrictions. For example, I think at some point, actually no, we never used it on our cloud, I think. But maybe at some point when we had a single machine that was running multiple versions of Odoo, we might have used it to make sure that everything got routed to the correct place. But honestly, I don't remember. That was years ago. So that's a whole section in a single command. And we have testing. Testing is a little bit more interesting for developers because there is some stuff that I know practically nobody uses, but is still super useful. First of all, you have the test enable command, which is the second one here. Until you set this up, no test will run. So that's the prerequisite to use any of these other options. You have the quite obviously named test file, which basically you give it the path to a Python test file, it will run it, and only that file. And then you have the test tags system. The test tag system is a super fast way to control which test you want to run or not. So if you ever set up some kind of CI using Travis or even or runbots code source, you can specify which tags need to run in which cases. So for example, if you only want to run the test of the CRM module, but not the ones that have a tagged, specific tag put on it saying it's a slow test, you can use the /CRM -slow command. If you want to launch a single Python class in the testing mechanism, you can specify this using the colon notation. If you want to run a single test from a class, you just use the dot notation. And this allows you to really, if you just wrote an anti-regression test while fixing a bug, you can simply call a single test using this mechanism and avoid, if you ever run the complete test suite, you know that it's super long, and this allows you to make it run in a few seconds. The other options that not a lot of people use is the screencast and screenshots, even though it can be mighty useful if you ever do browser tests or UI tests or integration tests, no matter what you want to call them. It basically allows the Odoo test mechanism to store screenshots and videos of failing JavaScript tests. Not JavaScript tests as in testing a component itself, but JavaScript tests in the sense that you pilot the whole interface of Odoo using the tour mechanism, which basically fills in fields, click on buttons, and makes a whole flow happen for you in literally seconds. If you do this, if you enable these options, and by giving it a directory in which to save these files, you can have basically a video of any failing test so that you don't have to rerun it by yourself to say, okay, at which step did it fail exactly, what was on the screen at that time. You have all that saved for you, and you can quickly debug without having to reproduce because the test just did it for you. By the way, and it's really important, if you run those tests on your machine, make sure to never run them in multiprocessing mode, because you might run into deadlocks where two processes are waiting on each other and nothing happens. So always make sure that you set a number of processes to 0 and switch back to multi-threaded mode when you run these browser tests. If you run the other kinds of Python tests, it's fine. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. But in the case of HTTP tours or browser tours, then yes, it's quite important. I know that our runbot is configured to not to save the videos, I think, but at least to save the screenshots. And as a quick litmus test of, okay, where should I look? It's a really good way to win a lot of time. After testing, we have the logging configuration, and this is usually used in a very broad way by most developers as well, even though you can have some really granular control over what logs get saved. First, you have the possibility to... okay, I immediately highlighted what I wanted to say. You have really deep control over the logging of Odoo. You can specify for basically any Odoo add-on or Odoo submodule, or even stuff that is outside of the scope of Odoo, like workzog, which is the HTTP server of Odoo. You can specify custom logging levels. So if you want to switch to debug mode inside of one of your own modules because you know something's happening, you can put some debug loggers into your code and then tell Odoo, okay, run on production with all the logs to the info level by default, except in this module where I want to have all the information I want because I'm tracking a bug that is difficult to reproduce or understand. It's really super useful because if you ever switch to the whole server to debug logging, you get completely polluted logs, which are really difficult to read. This can allow you to be really surgical in your debugging logs. Some other stuff in the logs is, it's a bit peculiar as well. That's something we developed for us years and years and years ago. Is basically a way to tell Odoo, copy all your logs into another database that sits on the same, usually on the same server, so that we can index these logs, search them. Personally, we only use it for our CI tool, so the runbot. You might have other needs for it. I'm not sure I would use it in production for the simple reason that it's just adding another possible level of failure to the system. But if you want to, it's there. And the other shortcuts, basically log file and syslog. Log file is just telling the system where should you put the log file, nothing fancy there. Syslog, on Unix, you can redirect all the log of Odoo to the syslog as well if you want. So if you have the syslog daemon running on your machine and you want to centralize everything, including Postgres, Odoo, Nginx, all in the same syslog, you can. That way you might have an easier time understanding the timing of an event. And all these other commands are basically shortcuts. So if you do log web, it's basically a way to tell the Odoo, okay, all the web requests should be at the debug level, the rest is info. Log SQL is the same, all the SQL commands will be displayed, the rest will be info only. And you have also some other log levels, which are basically, again, just shortcuts. I've listed them there. They're also super easy to find in the code. The ones you will usually switch to are debug SQL if you want to understand exactly what's happening at the ORM level, why a query is super slow, because then you can see exactly what got sent to the Postgres server, how much time it took to run, and start your deep dive into Postgres from there. The info level is useful. The error level is useful if you want the logs to be silent. For example, if you're in shell mode, you might want to silence the log because otherwise it will kind of interfere with your shell. But it's nothing fancy, it's just a bunch of shortcuts. Email is an interesting subject because it's kind of a duplicate of what we do inside of Odoo itself with the mail server, the outgoing email servers, but it allows you to make this complete configuration invisible to the user of the system, even the admin of the system. That's what we do on our cloud, for example. We have SMTP, our own SMTP servers, but obviously we don't want the password for these servers to be accessible to whomever uses one of our cloud databases. And so we set the configuration at the server level using these options so that the emails work out of the box without the customer needing to do anything. If they want to, they can override these settings by creating an outgoing email servers. Like you would probably do for a single on-premise installation. If you ever want to run a small cloud of Odoo database with a bunch of customers that all use the same SMTP server, that's also one good way to do it. And it has something that the outgoing mail servers do not support inside of Odoo, is the possibility to specify a specific SSL certificate to use to communicate with the server if you ever need to go into more secure deployment. This is quite well documented as well. This one I'm not going to go into the details of all the options because they're quite obvious. It's basically the port, the server, the credentials that you use to connect to the SMTP server. Nothing super fancy, and the email from and email filter basically work as in they would in Odoo, and it's all in the doc, and it's quite long to explain. By the way, be aware that whatever configuration you put there will get overridden by whatever the customer does into the database. So as soon as someone creates a mail server, an outgoing email server into the database itself, this will never get used. It will just be the last fallback. This means that your customers still have the possibility to use any custom domain that they might want to use, but if they don't set up anything, it still works out of the box. Now we're starting to get into more useful and complex stuff. Of course, the last slide will be the most interesting, but this one is already quite important in production deployments. You have first the basic stuff, which is just the connection info to the database. So you can specify the user and password to use to connect to the cluster if you're not using a local connection via socket. You can also specify a single database to work on, which is quite important for other commands as well. So if you want to update, install modules, disable demo data, enable tests, you will, of course, need to specify on which database the test should run, the module should be installed. You cannot install a module on a whole cluster at once. You have to do it database by database. But otherwise, it has also impacts in terms of filtering. For example, if you use -d and a specific database name, you will only be able to connect to that database in the web UI. we have, okay, it should have been animated, but this one is actually quite rare unless you do a really custom Postgres installation when you put the binaries for the pg dump, pg restore tools someplace weird. And it really should be weird. For example, if you do multiple versions of the Postgres tool, Postgres server on your machine, you might do this. Otherwise, basically, if you need pg dump, somewhere in Odoo, what happens is that Odoo will just launch a which pgdump commands, which will tell it where the binary is and use that. So normally you practically never use this. And something that is really important is the max database connections arguments. You have two parameters for this. If I remember correctly, the gevent db max connection argument is new. In the past, you only had one argument for all the kinds of processes that Odoo ran on. Now we have split it. This means that you can have a really high number of parallel connections to the server for the chat process, so the long polling, the gvented process, which will need to connect to a lot, to connect to the database a lot in parallel, because it needs to listen to notifications for multiple clients. But on the other hand, for normal processes, you might want to have this number capped somehow so that it doesn't open too many connections to the database and leave them open, which might use some RAM on your system and might need to be reduced to avoid eating too much resources. Basically, the minimum that you will ever want as the number of max connection for a normal process is 2. Honestly, if you ever go that low, you probably need to upgrade the hardware you run on, because you're going to run into other problems if you're that tight on resources. But below 2, it just won't work. Usually, we would advise, if you have a server that has multiple databases hosted on the same server, to have this number a bit high, for the same simple reason that each request to a specific database will open a connection to that database, and if you don't have enough resources, it will get deleted at the end of the request. On the other hand, what you usually want is for these connections to remain in a connection pool, so that Odoo can just reuse it if another request comes from for the same database. And that way you save it a little bit on response time. So if you have, I don't know, 20 databases on the same server, you should at least push this number to 40 or something like this, so that all connections can be kept alive in the connection pool. If you are in multi-threading mode, so basically if you're on Windows, you should be aware that this is the connection pool for the whole server, not per thread, but for the whole server. So you should be sure that there are enough connections to connect at least once or twice to every database or to every parallel request that you might have. So if you expect the load to be something like, okay, I expect to have 10 requests per second to be processed, make sure that you have at least 20-something database connections available. For the chat worker, I won't say set it as high as you can, because that's really bad advice, but set it high, which is the next bad advice I can give. Basically, you can expect that all concurrent users will use one connection at the same time on this worker if you have only one server. So basically, if you have 100 users, you can expect the gvented worker to have at least 100 connections at the same time. So keep it quite high. And the final option for the database settings is the DB template. It's quite rare to need it. I think we used it at some point to pre-configure cloud databases, so that if you want to start on odoo.com with CRM and e-commerce installed, we already have a database ready with the complete data loaded, and instead of having to install all the modules, we just copy the template. You can also do that if you want. Honestly, for development, it's not that useful, especially if you have database schemas that change as you develop, because obviously your template will be outdated quite soon. But on production, if you run something like our cloud, it might be useful to gain some time when creating databases. We have some stuff related to language processing. it's basically the same kind of options that you can use inside the database itself, with the exception that you can also specify a language to start the database in. Usually by default, you will start with Odoo in English and then install other languages. If you use this command, so the load language command, you can start with only French or Dutch or German installed and not a single trace of English, besides the untranslated terms, of course. The other options to load and to export module translations, it's basically the exact same thing that happens if you go into the technical settings and use the wizard to export or import or export PO or CSV files. It can be useful if you want to generate the PO files for your module to start translating them. But again, you can do it from the web UI as well, so there's not that much usefulness here. Security, again, a section with only one argument is the no database list. You will probably always want to set this on if you're on a production deployment. Otherwise, it basically means that anyone can query the server and get a list of all the databases that are on the cluster that match the DB filter argument that you put in earlier, which is not something you want, because it's basically the less information you reveal about the system, the less security attack surface you have, the less attack surface you have. So we advise you to always disable the database list in production deployments. It, of course, blocks it at the web level, so you cannot access the database manager or the database list. It also blocks it at the API level. So if someone does an XML RPC call or a JSON RPC call, they won't be able to get the list either. So by default, locally, you shouldn't really care about this. In production, always set it up. We have the MISC stuff. And we're nearly to the most interesting slide of the whole talk. This one is still a little bit interesting because it has the dev mode options. I think it has become quite well known nowadays that we have some tools for dev mode. It was brand new a few years back, and not a lot of people knew about it. We have the XML mode in the dev tool that allows you to modify views, and I really do mean views. If you modify, for example, a window action or a server action, this will not have any effect. But for views, it means that whatever you change in your IDE, you just reload the tab in the browser, and it gets loaded from file instead of being loaded from the database. So if you want to iterate super quickly on a form or a Kanban view, that's really super useful. We have the QWeb mode. It basically triggers more logs on the server regarding the backend rendering of QWeb templates. So website pages, for example, or PDF reports. It also allows you to set up in your QWeb code a debug command. And when the rendering reaches this point, you will get thrown into a debugger at that point. And so you can see how the template has been compiled, all the variables that are available in the scope of the QWeb rendering engine at this point. It's basically super useful if you want to debug some stuff that does advanced manipulations of reports. It's quite rare to use it. Usually the XML mode and reload mode are the most useful. Reload is basically live reloading of your Python code. It only watches the modules, so basically your models and controllers. If you modify something in the Odoo server itself, this will never see it, and you will have to restart manually. But for modules themselves, it can be super useful. You modify a controller, you modify a method, it will be applied immediately and reloaded. However, it does not update your module. So for example, if you start modifying a model by adding fields or renaming stuff, like fields or the model itself, it will not be updated. And so you might have code that runs with a non-matching database schema, and then you run into huge bugs. So if you have a modify model in this mode and you get huge bugs, just update the module and you should be good to go. So yeah, it auto-reloads the server when it sees that you have done some changes. You need a specific system set up on your package set up on your Linux distribution. It's called iNotify, and the Python library that goes with it, but nothing super fancy. And you have the all dev mode, which basically does everything all at once. If you ever run into a debugger, for example, by setting a tdebug directive in a report, you can specify which interface should be used. For example, bpython, ipython. Same for the shell mode. You can specify which tool to use using the shell interface option. Stop after. Yeah, okay, that's the shell interface again. The stop after init, it's really funny because nobody knows about this one, or a lot of people don't. But if you ever need to update a module, for example, on production, you have the server that is running. You might do the update on the side to have as little loss of available time. And when you use the stop after init command, it means that if you tell the server to update a module, as soon as it's done, the server kills itself and never start listening to HTTP requests. It's basically also useful for tests because then at the end of the test, the server stops itself and you know that whatever it was doing is now done in your CLI. If you're watching your side screen with one eye, you know that the tests are finished. The memory count and transient age limit basically tells the system when it should clean up transient models, so basically what we call wizards. By default, it's 1 hour. You can also set custom limits in time and in the size of the table. Honestly, you rarely need to set this up at all, but if you want, it's there. The max cron threads, it's the maximum number of threads, or if you're in multiprocessing mode, the maximum number of processes dedicated to background tasks. It also works for multiprocessing, even though the name speaks about threads, so that's quite important to know. Unaccent simply means that you want to use the unaccent function of Postgres to have text searches match accented characters or not. You will usually always want to have this enabled because even if your customer is only working in English, they might have customers that use foreign names. And if you look for someone named Rafael without the tréma on the E, you still want to find them. And the geo-IP databases, it's can be quite interesting as well if you use the CRM features of the website to know where the visitors come from. This comes from the data comes from this database that you can download freely from a website called MaxMind. And if you don't need a lot of detail, for example, if you don't need to know in which city people are based on their IP, you just need the country, you will be better off using the country database because it's much smaller and it increases performance a little bit by not having to look up complex IP tables for the system to know where the customer is coming from. It's not a huge impact on the server, but if you are really watching the website performance, it can improve stuff a little bit. And finally, the crux of this talk is the multiprocessing modes, because I know that this question comes a lot online. How many workers should I set up? What limit should I set up? There was another talk yesterday about this, which I shamelessly took slide from my colleague Nicolas Saint-Lay. And basically, the advice is always the same. If you're in production, you should nearly always be in multiprocessing mode. This is really the default that you should use. Otherwise, you're basically wasting all the resources of your CPU, because without the multiprocess mode, you can only use one process at a time. So you have 16 cores on your CPU. You're not in multiprocessing mode. You're wasting 15 cores. So always switch to multiprocessing mode. And the number of workers you should use is basically the number of cores on your system times 2 plus 1, just to say that you should be a little bit above the double of the CPU numbers. And if you want to compute how much resource you need, basically we assume when we do our napkin calculations for sizing, that one worker, one process is more or less 6 users. 6 users that work at the same time and that do normal stuff in Odoo. This usually means that your accountant, which does a lot of data entry and a lot of processing, counts for 2 people. And the guy that only comes in the morning, checks in and checks out in the evening, basically counts for 0 people because he used the system for 2 seconds a day. So one user is not always one user, but if you take these numbers, that's the kind of numbers we use. And then you have the limits to make sure that all these processes do not overuse your system. You can put soft and hard memory limits. So soft limits mean that at the end of the requests, if the process got over that limit, it gets killed. The hard limit means that whatever the process is doing, if it goes over that limit, it's killed instantly and recycled. But that means that someone on the other hand of the line got an error. You should, of course, make sure that the hard limit is set so that no process can take like half the memory of your system. But in the past, we had more memory leak than before. These days, it's really rare to have something happens that is not a serious bug. So you can have some leeway into this. The defaults are not bad. You can leave them, and you can increase them a little bit if you have really a lot of RAM. CPU time is basically useless because a lot of what Odoo does is actually happening into Postgres and not in the Python code itself. So leave the default, it doesn't matter, you will never reach it anyway. The real limit time is actually the one you want to set up. It should usually match the timeout, the request timeout that you set into the web server like Nginx or Apache. And it basically means that after 10 minutes or 2 minutes of processing, if whatever the customer asked is not ready, you stop what you're doing because it's probably never going to finish. Note that by default, this is set to 120 seconds, which is enormous if you think about a website, but which can be quite limiting if you have a huge amount of data. For example, if you do accounting reporting on millions of lines, 2 minutes might not be enough for Postgres to crunch the numbers. So in some cases, you might want to think about this limit, but if you are doing a small Odoo installation, a small setup with a few users, then the 2 minutes is probably quite enough. And you can also set up a different limit for background task, which is much more useful because background tasks, usually we use them to delegate stuff that takes a lot of time. So this limit will usually be much higher. I think by default, it's also 2 minutes. You should definitely increase it to something like 10, 20, 30 minutes to leave, for example, the time for the mail queue if you use mass mailing to be processed. If you use online payments, it's also where the post-processing of the transaction happens, and that can take a little bit of time. So make sure it has enough time. And in the past, we also recycled workers after a set amount of requests. This still works. I think by default, it's 8,000 requests or something. But since we have very fewer memory leaks that we had in the past, honestly, leave the default. You basically will never have it. You can even set it higher. You don't really need to recycle after a number of requests. So that was indeed the one aspect where we have the most questions. These numbers are documented or mentioned in our documentation. This is the link to the CLI options that I showed. We have also a deployment setup, a deployment documentation that speaks about these limits, especially for deploying. I think it should be somewhere here. Okay. You know what? Okay, I'm not on the right place, but we have documentation for that. I just don't have it at hand. And that's more or less it for this very complete list of commands. I'm going to go check if there are questions. Yeah, not that many as I expected. It's not super complicated. Is there a way to use scaffold to create modules as our own format? Yes, though you will need, I will quickly launch it. Yes. You can simply set the... I still have 2 minutes. On a plus le temps? Okay. I'm sorry. I'm out of time, even though I thought I had 2 minutes left. Whoever asked those questions, just come and meet me there. I'll wait a few minutes so that you can get your answer. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.